Soon after the conversation in the park, the firefighter told police that they broke up, and she went crazy. She showed up at his Long Beach home and told his wife about the affair, brandishing emails and photos. She detailed the affair in a letter to the dance studio where his wife worked, Gomez told police. It was cleverly written in the third person, according to a police report, as if it was a close friend of Jill's who was writing it. Irvine Police Detective Mark Andriozzi called Kellie Peters in late March 2011, more than a month after the drugs were discovered in her car outside Plaza Vista Elementary, the school where she volunteered for years. He couldn't tell her much, but he wanted to reassure her. The department now has strong evidence that the drugs had been planted, as she insisted all along. He didn't reveal what the crime lab had just reported. Jill Easter's DNA was on the pot pipe, and the Vicodin pills, though not on the Percocet, and Kent Easter's DNA was on all three. Police insisted that Peters keep quiet, even about the little she did know. Anything, she said, could derail the investigation. If word got back to the Easters, they might find some way to stop it cold. Now and then, the police told her, "You have no idea how much we want to get them." Months went by, and then they were nowhere close to making arrests. Jill Easter had hired Paul Meyer, an Orange County defense lawyer so formidable that judges turned to him when they were in trouble. Kent Easter had enlisted Thomas Beinert Jr., a former federal prosecutor with expertise in white-collar crime. Detectives knew that just around the time of the drug planting, Kent Easter's BlackBerry had been pinging off a tower near the crime scene, and that it had exchanged 15 texts with his wife's iPhone during those pre-dawn hours. So far, defense arguments had thwarted police from examining whatever incriminating messages the phones might contain. Sitting in a windowless office, Jensen, the volunteer special master, combed through 20,000 emails on the BlackBerry, weeding out the thousands that seemed to fall under attorney-client and attorney work product privilege. What he was not qualified to do, he told the judge, was to screen the phone for spousal privilege. And when this chore still undone in late October 2011, more than 8 months after the crime, he insisted he was done with the case. He had a practice to run. "I never in a million years thought it would be like this," Jensen said later. "I put in a Herculean amount of work." The district attorney's office did further screening, and in November, detectives got a stash of non-privileged Easter texts. To their chagrin, the most anticipated ones, the 15 pre-dawn texts, had been erased before the phones were seized. At the Irvine Police Department, the frustration was climbing. The prosecutor, Deputy District Attorney Linda Fernandez, seemed stuck in a holding pattern as the court weighed whether to release more evidence. A year passed. The police investigation, including the embarrassing search of his office, had not harmed Kent Easter's career. His firm named him an equity partner, cutting him into a share of the profits. For Kellie Peters, it was a time of self-consciousness and dread. In the mornings, she searched her car carefully for drugs. At Plaza Vista Elementary, where she still had a desk in the front office, people were always bringing her cakes and telling her she was in their prayers. Now and then, she saw Jill Easter arrive. Looking rushed to pick up her son, Peters felt a chill and looked away. Her daughter Sydney, who turned 11 that year, refused to sleep alone, fearing that she would be abducted. At recess, Peters would find her sitting alone or wandering the yard talking to herself. At the school's insistence, Peters sent her to the school therapist and came to regret it, because it meant Sydney was being pulled out of class and made to feel even more like a spectacle. Peters bought her a sketchbook to carry at school, and her daughter hid behind it, drawing superheroes and ponies. Peters asked other moms to please encourage their kids to play with her, but this made her daughter feel pitied, and eventually she was begging to leave the school. Anxiety pervaded every hour. When Peters came home, she hurried to her door, afraid someone might be hiding in the hallway. Her husband would return from work to find her crying. Peters slept fitfully, haunted by dreams in which Jill Easter was slashing her throat. In her waking hours, she found her hands pulling her scarf protectively around her neck. She discovered a bald spot on her scalp. She got off Facebook. She snapped when people forgot to lock the doors. At the big artificial lake where she took her dogs and where she had watched generations of Canada geese grow up, she now feared to walk alone. She made sure her friends were with her, one on each side. Hold on, I'm getting you another picture of the fake lake. Her famously safe master-planned city now seemed alive with hidden menace. As she walked among Irvine's tidy houses, she became fixated on how vulnerable they all seemed, with windows to climb through and sliding glass doors to break into. It made her grateful to live in an apartment with one door in and one door out. Often her family would catch Kellie Peters talking to herself. She would be in the kitchen, reliving her encounter with police at the school, pleading, explaining. "Please put the drugs away," she would mutter. "I don't want people to see them. I have an enemy. Her name is Jill Easter. I have an enemy." Some of the detectives were reading Jill Easter's self-published novel, searching for psychological clues. She was adept at fashioning characters consumed by a primal need for payback. The plot of Holding House followed a Berkeley-educated heroine, Libby, and her Berkeley-educated friends as they launched a foolproof crime: kidnap a well-heeled target and hide out in Panama to await a wired ransom. All goes awry, and Libby is spurned by her narcissistic lover and criminal confidant, the chiseled and effortlessly handsome Joe. She finds herself churning over her one new mission in life: to make Joe pay for abandoning her. She drains his bank account. She sets him up for a visa violation. She makes an anonymous call to the cops. As they close in, he leaps to his death. Guilt consumes her. It was possible to read Easter's novel as a cautionary tale about the self-immolating temptations of vengeance, the wisdom of avoiding beautiful narcissists, or the inevitable doom of foolproof criminal plots. These were not the themes emphasized in marketing the book, as police learned when they discovered her online promotional page, which instead touted the seductions of lawbreaking. Ever dream about the perfect crime? It's in this book. As you read, you'll be wondering why no one has thought of it before. It's shockingly simple, twisted, and 100% possible. Once you read about it, you'll be tempted to pull it off. The Orange County DA's Special Prosecutions Unit dealt with crimes of particular sensitivity, high-profile cases involving doctors and cops, lawyers, and politicians. Christopher Duff, a career prosecutor in his early 40s, joined the team in the spring of 2012. Among the files that landed on his desk was a bizarre caper involving a pair of married Irvine attorneys suspected of planting drugs in a neighbor's car. Hold on, I'm just getting you another picture of the prosecutor. That's Christopher Duff. Duff was struck by how thoroughly the Irvine police had investigated a crime in which the victim had suffered no physical harm. They had put 20 detectives on the case against Kent and Jill Easter at one time or another, and the lead investigator had spent 6 months on it exclusively. Duff considered the possibilities. In so many places, he thought it would have gone differently. If the attempted frame-up had happened in one of the gang neighborhoods of Los Angeles, where he used to prosecute shootings, rather than in a rich, placid city in Orange County, if the cop who found the stash of drugs in Kellie Peters' car had been a rookie rather than a sharp-eyed veteran, if she had been slightly less believable, it was easy to picture Peters, the PTA president, at her daughter's elementary school, would have left the campus in the back of a patrol car, a piercing sight for the teachers who loved her and relied on her, for the parents who had entrusted their kids to her for years. It would have stolen not just her freedom, but her name. When Duff met Peters, she seemed raw-nerved and brittle, the kind of person who would be traumatized by a trip through jail. It would have broken Kellie, Peters said. It would have broken Kellie Peters, he said. I just know it. He also knew jurors would find Peters sympathetic. She was never far from tears when she talked about the Easters' plot to destroy her and the ways it had shaken her sense of security. Duff was inheriting a case that had languished for more than a year, to the vocal frustration of Irvine cops. Duff's office had battled in court for access to the Easters' smartphones, whose contents was shielded by attorney privileges. What seemed to fuel the Easters' sense of superiority, their status as lawyers, was now protecting them from the consequences of their crime, Duff thought. Looking over the evidence, the prosecutor decided he had enough. He had their DNA on the pot pipe and the painkillers planted in the victim's car. He had motive and opportunity, and he had incriminating smartphone pings. He had convicted killers unless. The Easters expected a warning. If charges were ever filed, their lawyers told them the DA's office had assured them of advance notice. They would allow the Easters to surrender at an appointed time with bail already arranged, and they could be in and out of booking quickly. They would avoid the pinch of handcuffs, a luxury available to people with money and good lawyers. But Irvine police showed little inclination to minimize the Easters' discomfort, and Duff said he was unaware of any surrender agreement. In June 2012, police moved secretly under his direction. They obtained arrest warrants, careful not to record them in the public court computers. Kent Easter had just dropped off 2 of his children at tennis camp when the patrol car pulled him over near a busy intersection in Irvine. He was heading to work to his Newport Beach office tower with his master of the universe view of the 14th floor. On the 14th floor, he was in a suit, an equity partner, a high-dollar litigator. He had a deposition that day and boxes of legal papers in the trunk. Police called a tow truck for his Toyota Camry. They handcuffed him and drove him to the county jail in Santa Ana. He was standing in the intake courtyard when he saw his wife, who had been arrested at their house, arrive in a squad car. The Easters were being charged with conspiring to plant drugs in Peters' car, the twisted culmination of a year-long vendetta against the school volunteer. They were quickly out on bail, but their mugshots were all over the news. Hang on. That's his mugshot. And that's hers. No one had been killed, but something about the crime, the power, and the pettiness of the defendants, combined with the harmlessness of their victim, engendered a depth of indignation few cases matched. Pure wickedness, said one online commentator. One of the most malicious things I've ever heard, said another. Orange County had long been dogged by images of rich and plastic people. The stereotypes fueled by the Real Housewives franchise, with its rotating cast of socialites, their lives in a whirl of feuds, shopping trips, personal trainers, lovers, and plastic surgeons. And now the Easters became symbols of this status-obsessed at its most deranged, with an inexplicable crime that seemed to throb weirdly at the nexus of suburban psychosis and class privilege. And it had happened in Irvine, no less, the county's model master plan city, inviting people to contemplate the ugliness that seethed behind closed doors in places that overpromised order and niceness and green. Kent Easter was told to clear out his law office at Stradling, Yoka, Carlson, and Roth. A human resources representative escorted him out of the Newport Beach building with his boxes. That was the end of his $400,000 a year career. It seemed inconceivable that he'd ever work for a firm again. None could risk the publicity, but he might salvage a semblance of a career. As the months passed, however, Duff Duff won felony indictments against the Easters and showed no willingness to let them plead to misdemeanors, which might have allowed them to remain lawyers. This had far sharper urgency for Kent Easter, the family breadwinner, than for Jill Easter, whose license had been inactive for years. DNA from both Easters had turned up on the planted drugs, but the weight of the evidence was stronger against the husband than against the wife. It was Kent who had been captured on tape making a phony call to police implicating Peters, and it was Kent's BlackBerry that had been pinging near Peters' car when the drugs were planted. But it was Jill Easter who took the blame for planting the drugs, in a declaration filed with the court and quickly sealed. It was not a confession in the normal sense. It could not have been used against her. It was offered for a narrow purpose, as part of an ingenious defense motion to try the Easters separately. Her admission of guilt provided a strong legal basis for doing so. Kent Easter would naturally wish to put her on the stand in his own defense, but couldn't legally do so if they were put on trial together. He could do it if the trials were severed. Superior Court Judge John Conley listened to the defense argument and to the prosecutor's impassioned opposition. If the judge decided to split the trials, it was easy to envision calamity for the state's case. The defense would push to have Jill Easter tried first. Jurors wouldn't hear her confession, and the relatively thin evidence against her, coupled with the skill of her attorney, Paul Meyer, would give her a plausible chance at acquittal. And then she would take the stand at her husband's trial. Immune from the threat of jail, if she could testify credibly that she had planted the drugs, he would go free too. Game over. It was a far-seeing strategy, equal parts cold logic and daring do. But it had a flaw. First, the judge had to find Jill Easter's confession believable. He seemed to have doubts. Motion denied. The Easters would have to stand trial together. By fall 2013, Duff was making final preparations for trial, papering his home and office with yellow Post-it notes on which he would scribble ideas at all hours. Then his telephone rang. It was Meyer. Jill Easter would agree to plead guilty to a felony count of false imprisonment by fraud or deceit. This would spare her the humiliation of sitting through a trial and would also allow her to testify for the husband on whom she still depended financially. The sentence to begin after his trial was 120 days in county jail. She would serve less than half, plus 100 hours at Costa Mesa soup kitchen. She was promptly disbarred. Her Boalt Hall law degree was now useless. The Central Justice Center in Santa Ana was a sad wreck of a building with overcrowded elevators, graffiti-scratched bathrooms, and walls covered with fading portraits of former judges, retired or dead. Into this setting, in November 2013, strode Kent Easter and his imposing defense team. It was headed by Thomas Beinert Jr., once Orange County's top federal prosecutor. 2 years earlier, Best Lawyers magazine had named him the county's white-collar lawyer of the year. In polish and pedigree, Beinert seemed more of a creature of the federal courthouse down the block, a palace of dome ceilings, cherry wood paneling, and honey-hued travertine. Hang on, I'm just putting another picture up for you. From the witness stand, Kellie Peters faced jurors and recounted her experience, shaking with tears. She described being detained by the police when they found the drugs in her car at the Plaza Vista school. When Beinert questioned Officer Charles Shaver about the day, the defense attorney sought to minimize her ordeal. She wasn't handcuffed, was she? No. Put in a squad car? No. Booked? No. Duff counterattacked to demonstrate how Peters had pleaded with Shaver not to arrest her. The prosecutor threw himself to his knees in front of the jury box, hands aloft beseechingly. She fell to her knees, crying, begging you, please, 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 correct? Yes, Shaver said. Having failed to fend off arrest, job loss, indictment, and trial, Kent Easter had one gambit left. The successful litigation.
of a trusting husband. No more, no less. But it's also a case that sadly, as we've all learned after the fact, about a dishonest wife.
The successful litigator who had blazed through Stanford in 3 years would present himself as an emasculated patsy. His wife had berated him, deceived him, bludgeoned him with guilt. While Kent is a very good human being, he didn't have a backbone when it came to his wife, Beinert told jurors. She wore the pants in the family. She pushed him around. How this might explain away the evidence against him wouldn't be clear until the defendant himself took the stand. Tall, composed, and well-groomed, Easter looked confident as he raised his right hand. He swore to tell the truth. Finally, he said he would get the chance to explain. Hang on, I hope you guys are still there. I can't see you. It was my wife, Kent Easter told jurors. She had become obsessed with destroying the PTA mom, he said. She had planted the pot and the painkillers in Kellie Peters' car. She had lured him into the criminal scheme. She was the reason he sat here today, his life a shambles, on trial for a felony. Easter had taken the witness stand in his own defense, casting himself as a figure instantly familiar to aficionados of 1940s crime dramas. The hapless cuckold and sap, undone by a femme fatale and her Noorish machinations. It was a pitiable, pitiable tale. He was a hard man to warm up to. He had an air of bloodless detachment that came across as arrogance. He had been a busy man, he explained, logging 200 billable hours a month for his big Newport Beach law firm, trying to appease a hectoring spouse who was never satisfied. He knew that his wife Jill had been unfaithful to him off and on for years. I felt that my job was to be a husband, to stay married, Easter testified. Nobody in our family had ever gotten divorced. As a glimpse into the toxic power dynamic of the marriage, as a window into his wife's obsessiveness, Easter's team presented Defense Exhibit L. It was an email she sent him in March 2010. He said, interrupting his workday. The subject line? Need to get serious. The theme? How to crush the lowly school volunteer who she insisted had deliberately locked their 6-year-old son out of his elementary school a month before. The email was a litany of demands. She wanted Kellie Peters' background checked. She wanted her arrested. She wanted her slapped with a restraining order. She wanted to sue Peters, the school district, the school board, the Public Schools Foundation. She wanted action by tomorrow. The email ended in bold capitals. Why are we letting this no one abuse our son and then trash our family with like 1,000 exclamation points? Why with like 1,000 more exclamation points? She thought I had let her down, that I had failed her, Easter said. I hadn't pushed hard enough on this. As her obsession with Peters intensified, he tried to be the reasonable one, the moderating force. He had not known of her scheme to frame Peters, he insisted. In telling this story, Kent Easter had to explain away a big problem. It was his BlackBerry that had been pinging near Peters' PT Cruiser in the pre-dawn hours when the drugs were planted in a pouch behind the driver's seat. His wife's iPhone had been pinging at their Irvine home a mile away. Kent Easter was ready with an explanation. We swapped phones. He had been at home, sleeping fitfully, sore from recent surgery. She had left her iPhone in their bedroom to charge and had taken his BlackBerry. He thought she was downstairs, tending to their sick daughter. Unbeknownst to him, she had slipped out to plant the drugs. He was at work later that day, he said, when she called him to say she'd seen Peters popping pills and driving like a madwoman at Plaza Vista Elementary in Irvine. She insisted that he call police, and he reluctantly agreed, afraid that she would again belittle him as a failure. To disguise himself, he gave the police the first name that popped into his head, which happened to be V.J. Trandrasackler, based on an Indian neighbor. He then tried his untrained best to mimic the man's accent. It's incredibly uncomfortable to sit here and listen to something so ridiculous, Easter said after the call was played in court. I feel stupid for having believed her and put my entire career and children in jeopardy. To flesh out its portrayal of Jill Easter as an overbearing shrew with a talent for weaponizing guilt, the defense played a tape of her haranguing her former lover, a married Los Angeles City firefighter who had been already wired by the police. She accused him of abandoning her as police zeroed in on her and her husband as suspects. Don't just pull your head out of the sand. This is the moment. This is when I needed someone and you turned your back on me, she had cried, and I will not survive this. It was a tone Kent Easter said he had heard before. That's the voice that I hear when I saw the need to get serious email, he said. That's the voice that plays in my mind. I mean, that's when she is upset about something and wants something. Now it was Christopher Duff's turn to ask Easter a few questions, an opportunity the prosecutor relished. Some prosecutors employed an aw shucks persona, and some excelled at righteous indignation. Duff specialized in biting sarcasm. He had a stage actor's gift for outsized facial expressions, so jurors could read varieties of incredulity on his face across the room. The prosecutor stood in front of Kent Easter. He wanted to know why he remained married to Jill Easter, and in fact had been living with her until a month and a half earlier. How was this possible, considering all the ways she had betrayed him? Sir, this is the mother of my 3 children, Easter said, and my wife. Turning to the night of the drug planting, Duff asked why Jill Easter would leave her iPhone, whose passcode he claimed to possess, considering how easily he might have seen her trove of salacious exchanges with her latest lover. I mean, she has 50 Shades of Grey on her cell phone, correct? I don't know what you mean. Duff was close enough to see that Easter, who had remained composed under his own attorney's friendly questioning, seemed increasingly nervous. Easter said it just didn't occur to him to look for her texts. I had no idea that they were in there, so I wouldn't have known to look there or not, Easter said. You knew your wife had already had one affair? You were concerned that she was out that night having another affair? And you had the one piece of evidence in your hand that could show you right then and there? Correct? Duff now mocked the story of the smartphone swap. If his wife had really been sneaking around Peter's apartment complex in possession of his BlackBerry, wouldn't she have worried about it going off unexpectedly? And, all of a sudden, Who Let the Dogs Out starts playing on your ringtone, Duff said. That was not my ringtone, Easter said. Everyone was waiting for Jill Easter to walk into the room. She represented Kent Easter's best chance at acquittal, thought Irvine detective Mark Andriozzi, who sat beside the prosecutor. The villain of her husband's narrative, she had already pleaded guilty to her part in the crime. If she went to the witness stand and took the blame for everything, if she backed up his story and managed to come off semi-credible, jurors might have reasonable doubt. Duff expected the defense to call her. He was looking forward to the cross. Instead, the defense rested. They think they don't need her, Duff thought. They think they've won. The defense's closing argument dwelled at length on Kent Easter's cuckolding and Jill Easter's supposed stratagems. It was a tale as superheated with intrigue and double crosses as a Pulp Fiction plot. Lust, concocted alibis, and frame-ups, within frame-ups like Russian nesting dolls. Her husband was her meal ticket, said defense attorney Thomas Binnert, Jr., but the firefighter had her heart. On the very night she planted the drugs, the defense contended, she had found time to disappear for a tryst, which she recalled in a text to her lover the next morning. Good morning, you glorious man. I am still swimming in romance. Beinart portrayed her as an imaginative schemer. Hadn't she written a novel about the perfect crime? If the plot to frame the PTA mom unraveled, he said, Jill Easter had made sure that her husband's DNA would be on the planted drugs so that he would have to take the fall. Her calculation even extended to devising an alibi video featuring herself and her sick daughter with a timestamp meant to show she was at home at the time of the crime, the defense argued. If someone was going to go down for this, it had to be Kent, not her, Beinart said. He was expendable. The charge was one count of false imprisonment by fraud or deceit. The jury could not reach a verdict. 11 wanted to convict. One woman felt sorry for Easter. Again, a jury was selected. Again, Kellie Peters cried. Again, Kent Easter told his lamentable story, and once more, 10 months after the first trial, people watched and waited for Jill Easter's entrance. She had finished her 2-month jail term. This time, the defense called her into the courtroom. But there was a complication. She pointed to her ears, claiming hearing loss. She wanted more than a sign language interpreter. She wanted a screen on which to read the lawyer's questions in real time. At the prosecutor's table, they believed this was a ruse to throw off the cross-examination. It would be harder to trap her. She'd get extra seconds to process questions. The judge said she would have to make do with an interpreter like everyone else. The defense huddled, reconsidering the wisdom of putting her on the stand, and sent her home. For Duff, there remained the challenge of trying to explain why the Easters wanted to ruin Kellie Peters in the first place. The provocation had seemed irrationally small. A school volunteer, Peters had inadvertently left the Easter's 6-year-old son in the back recess yard for a few minutes one afternoon. Peters explained that the boy had been slow to line up after tennis class, which Jill Easter seemed to perceive as an insult to his intelligence. There's a whole show, Orange County Housewives, where all the housewives are crazy, Duff told jurors in his closing statement. This is the 21st century, where everyone thinks that their son should be the star quarterback, star shortstop, batting first, whatever it is, whatever happened, whatever their son said, got these two very upset, and it escalated. As he had at the first trial, Duff emphasized that the Easters remained married. How uncomfortable is it at that dinner table? Duff asked. Jill, can you pass me the mashed potatoes? Please? Yeah, okay. Don't frame me while you're passing the mashed potatoes, please, though, really? They're still together. The most dramatic moments of the second trial came during Duff's final remarks to the jurors. He noted that the location of cell phones is knowable in 3 ways. When they ping against the nearest tower during calls, when texts are exchanged, and when automatic data checks monitor the device's health. Until now, the data check records, though put into evidence, had barely been mentioned. Irvine detectives had missed their significance during their investigation, as had Duff during the first trial. Preparing for this trial, however, Duff had pored over them carefully and discovered what he thought might destroy Kent Easter's alibi for good. It had been long established from the text pings that Jill Easter's iPhone had been at the Easters' home on the night in question. For at least part of that night, however, the data checks indicated that her phone had also been near Peters' apartment. It had been pinging off the local tower intermittently from midnight to 8 a.m. The Easters had executed the plot together while a babysitter watched their kids, the prosecutor argued. One had planted the drugs while the other acted as the lookout. Even if the Easters had swapped phones, the records put Kent Easter at the scene. Guess where this cell phone is, Duff said. By the victim's house. Oops. This seemed to catch the defense flat-footed, because he had already finished his closing argument. It was too late for Beinart to try to convince jurors this was junk science. After the jury left the room, he rallied against the prosecutor. He said he had been sandbagged. Duff replied that Easter's team had had the phone records for years. Either the defense had not looked at the records, Duff said, or was hoping that I would not look at the records. Judge Thomas Goethals saw no reason Duff couldn't save a good argument for the end. It seemed to me Mr. Duff made a strategic decision, he said. The jury needed only 2 hours to decide, guilty as charged. Then came another surprise for the defense. The judge ordered Kent Easter taken into custody. Easter hadn't expected this. He had made no arrangement for his 3 kids, for his bills. The jury gave him a day to arrange his affairs, out of concern for nothing but your children. When he told his wife the news that day, Easter said later in court papers she told him he should kill himself so she could collect on a $500,000 life insurance policy, and when he refused, she made other desperate suggestions, an escape to Belize with the kids, or her own suicide. He stayed up that night comforting her as he closed down his practice. He added, and the next morning he found the search term, "How to Kill Yourself," on her iPad. Easter had already been in jail for 5 weeks when he stood before Goethals for sentencing on October 2014. He faced up to 3 years in state prison. The judge made no secret of his contempt for Easter, but noted that the prisons were full. In a perfect world, I would send you to prison, largely as a statement of disgust for what you and your wife did, the judge said. Instead, he sentenced him to 180 days in county jail, of which he would serve half plus 100 hours of community service and 3 years probation. Easter did his time without the luxury of anonymity. Inmates recognized him from TV, and some thought he ought to be taken down. One day, he said, 2 of them knocked him down and bloodied his nose. He cleaned floors and toilets and read Game of Thrones in paperback. More than once, inmates asked him for legal advice, and some of them he liked. He had been an ardent Republican with little sympathy for lawbreakers, but now he pondered the colossal waste of time and talent exacted by the system. He had filed for divorce just before his second trial, and he was still serving his time when Jill Easter petitioned the court for custody of their 3 kids. Their dueling court filings provided as close a glimpse of their relationship as outsiders were ever likely to get. She wrote of his instability and his irrational behavior and described him as an angry workaholic and heavy drinker, prone to mood swings, who would isolate himself from his family by locking himself in the bathroom. She said he blamed his drinking on his difficult relationship with his Catholic parents, who had rejected her as a non-Catholic. She said he had threatened to take the kids if she didn't plead guilty to the drug planting. "I am trapped in an endless cycle of lashing out at you, even after using you as a human shield," he wrote to her from jail. According to her court filings, "I am sick." Released from jail in 2014, he complained in his own court papers that she wouldn't let him talk to their kids. She wouldn't give him updates on the family cat and wouldn't give him the airway machine he needed for his sleep apnea. The criminal case had exacerbated their fights, he said in the filing, and she once pepper sprayed his face in a rage. Helpless to stop her affairs, he said he needed a DNA test to prove his daughter was his. He said she used the word orange when she wanted him to stop talking about a subject like finances that made her too anxious. After her release from jail, he said she became depressed. She took anti-anxiety medication and binged on Netflix for days. Later, after they agreed to joint custody, he retracted his pepper spray accusation. "Moreover, Jill Easter has never been violent toward me or physically harmed me in any way," he wrote. "She was only ever loving and caring." Duff, the prosecutor, thought justice had been served, but after 2 criminal trials, there remained an irreducible mystery at the heart of it. What had prompted the Easters to go to such astonishing lengths over a slight so small? "The story that hasn't been told is why these people did it," Duff said. "Everyone asks me, and I have no answer." Rob Marcirio, an attorney for the Foothill Ranch law offices, was decorated with images of vintage motorbikes, shark fins, and bright green U.S. currency, wanted answers himself. He represented Kellie Peters in her civil suit against the Easters. He had waited patiently through the criminal trials for Kent Easter to serve his time, and he waited for his crack at the man and his wallet. And now, in a December 2015 deposition, he faced Easter across the table. Let me get another question, another picture. That's Kellie's lawyer. Easter was now a convicted felon, disgraced, on probation, his law license suspended, his disbarment pending. Still, the law threatened to exact a further price, monetary damages, for Peters' emotional distress. And still, he would not surrender an inch of ground or a ray of clarity. At some point in 2010 or 2011, did you and your wife hatch a plan to plant drugs in Kellie Peters' car and have her arrested? He asked. I have testified at length about this in 2 proceedings, and my testimony is what it is, Kent Easter said. The lawyer persisted. I'm entitled to an answer. Easter said, I've answered that twice in criminal court. That means nothing. I need an answer, sir, or else I'll move to compel. I'll seek sanctions. Okay, you can do that. I've answered it. You haven't answered it, sir. Easter insisted he didn't know who planted the drugs. Did your wife ever tell you that she did it? I can't answer that question due to spousal confidential communication.
Sir, did you knowingly participate in a scheme with your wife to frame Kellie Peters? No.
He felt sorry for Kellie Peters, Easter said, but he had been through some terrible experiences himself. I don't feel that she should have been as upset as she has been. The lawyer asked, so you think what you've gone through is worse than what you and your wife put Mrs. Peters through? I know that. Don't you think you'd feel better if you just said, you know what, I did it, I screwed up, I regret it, I'm sorry? Wouldn't that feel good to just say that? Is this a therapy session or a deposition? I would love to get some candor out of you after all this. Can't you just admit what you did? And that, okay, hang on. I'm just going to check if you guys are still here. Are you guys still here? You want to finish this another time? You're still here. Okay, because oh, you are, okay. All right, I think we have one last part. You want to just do it? Okay. Hang on, let me just get up another picture. Okay, that's the courtroom where Kent Easter pleaded for mercy from an Orange County jury while weighing his financial fate. A tall, lanky man sat alone on a bench outside courtroom 62. He was absorbed in the yellow legal pad balanced on his lap, silently mouthing what he had written there. He was recognizable to many of the attorneys who passed through this third-floor wing of the central justice system in Santa Ana. By now, he was accustomed to the stares of curiosity and contempt. The white shoe rainmakers in the $1,000 suits, the personal injury guys hustling a living on slip and falls, the overworked public defenders, they knew his mugshot from the news. Until recently, Kent Easter had been one of them, a member of the tribe in good standing, a sworn officer of the court. He sat atop the roiling, competitive heap of Orange County's 17,000 practicing lawyers, a $400,000 a year civil litigator, an equity partner in one of the county's biggest law firms. His career had been a trajectory of prestige schools, status gigs from Stanford to UCLA Law, to a big Silicon Valley firm, and finally to a 14th floor office in a Newport Beach tower overlooking the Pacific. That was before the arrests and the trials and the cameras, before his pedigree became a cudgel with which to flog him with, before strangers were writing him letters urging him to kill himself. Now he sat alone in the din of the courthouse hallway, wearing ill-fitting pants and a homely purple sweater. It was February 2016. His lips moved as he studied his legal pad. He was rehearsing a plea for mercy, his closing argument to jurors weighing his financial fate. Absent was the top-dollar legal talent that had flanked him throughout the 2 criminal trials. Finally, representing himself, he would face his fellow Orange County citizens alone. He would paint a picture of his almost total ruin and beg them not to make it complete. To Rob Marcerio, the attorney representing the plaintiff and her family, Kent Easter brought back memories of the William Macy character in Fargo, a man flailing to extricate himself from the web of his own doomed criminal scheme, losing more with each entangling lie. Here, as compensation for emotional distress, Kellie Peters wanted millions from him. Some of Kellie Peters' lawyer's buddies had told him the case was a long shot. Peters had suffered no physical injury and had kept her role as a school volunteer. But the more Easter tried to duck what he had done, Marcerio thought, the more the jurors would hate him. Easter sat alone at the defense table, without his co-defendant and ex-wife, Jill. When Marcerio chatted with him during court breaks, he found him oddly affable, low-key, disarmingly polite, with a sense of humor, and had to remind himself he was the enemy. Kent Easter and his wife, Jill Easter, plotted and planned and schemed to destroy the life of Kellie Peters for a full year, Marcerio told jurors in his opening remarks. He detailed their futile campaign to oust her from her volunteer job at Plaza Vista Elementary and their ill-fated plot to disgrace her by planting drugs in her car. When his turn came, Easter told jurors that Peters' tale of suffering was full of exaggerations and embellishments. He said he took responsibility for what happened, though he did so only in the vaguest terms, and he added, the fact that something very bad was done to a person does not give them a winning Powerball number. Hold on, let me get another picture. That's him, I guess, in his homely purple sweater. Marcerio put Easter on the stand. Had he conspired with his wife to plant drugs in Peters' car? Very stupidly and very unfortunately, yes, Easter replied. Marcerio pressed for specifics. Which one of you or your wife, actually planted the drugs in Mrs. Peters' car? Or was it both? It was my wife. That was in keeping with his failed defense during his criminal trials, in which he had cast her as the culprit. She had not testified at those trials, and no one knew what she might say. When Easter put on his case now and called her to the stand, with a sign language interpreter on hand for her claimed hearing loss, he did not seem angry at the woman he claimed had ruined him. Instead, his tone seemed almost wistful, his gaze tender. She was now calling herself Ava Everhart. And so he began, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Everhart." "Good afternoon." He began by acknowledging the damage he'd done to her name. "I probably could have treated you a little better, couldn't I have?" he said. "Yes." "Despite all of that, you've still been kind to me and haven't sought revenge, right?" "No." "I have known you since you were young. I don't know if you remember those days." "Yes." She was living with her parents in Newport Beach. Her father was an astrophysicist and inventor. But she did not mention this. She insisted she was not a child of privilege. She had worked 3 jobs to put herself through school. She surveyed the courtroom and said, I think I am the person that went to the best law school in this room, to be honest with you, and I'm proud of that. Doesn't mean I am spoiled or a bad person. But now her reputation was ruined, she complained. She had done nearly 2 months in jail. She was disbarred. Her law degree from Berkeley's Boalt Hall, useless. I lost everything. I mean everything, she said. I am not a school terrorizer, as I have read about myself. She wanted to dispel a misconception about her self-published crime thriller, Holding House, which Marsirio had invoked to illustrate her preoccupation with the perfect crime. The point of the book is these people think they have the perfect crime, and then it gets really messed up, she said. So the point is, there is no perfect crime. You can't think of one in your head because you will always be fooled, and that is the point of the book. Marsirio did not see much value in a lengthy cross-examination. He thought she had already buried herself. Hold on, another picture. Ma'am, on February 16, 2011, you planted illegal drugs in Kellie Peters' car, true? I pled guilty to that. Did you do it? No. That is what I thought. No more questions. It was time for Kent Easter to call his most important witness, and so he uttered one of the most melancholy sentences jurors would hear. At this time, I would just be calling myself. He took the stand, wearing one of the most unassuming sweaters that had seemed his sole wardrobe throughout the trial. He turned to the jury box and explained that he was, at 41, a broken man, a UCLA law grad who was sharing an apartment with his parents, his savings eviscerated by $250,000 in legal fees, barred even from driving for Uber or Lyft because of his felony conviction, relying on acquaintances to throw him a little work, and still the sole breadwinner for 3 kids, ages 8, 10, and 12. All this education that I have now is completely useless to me. By and large, he said, I have no expectation that I will ever be a lawyer ever again. Marsirio was convinced Easter was hiding money somewhere. Soon after his arrest, he pointed out Easter had transferred ownership of his Irvine house to his father-in-law. He told jurors not to be deceived. You know, I think he has a good act. He comes in here wearing the same sweater 3 days in a row, Marsirio said. He probably has a dozen tailored suits at home, and yet he's in here wearing the same sweater trying to tell you that he's poor? Don't believe it. For Kellie Peters, the run-in with the Easters amounted to the worst experience of her life, Marsirio said. Her daughter Sydney, who was 10 when the Easters tried to frame her mother, had refused to sleep alone for fear. The Easter monster would abduct her, Marsirio said. She had grown isolated from her friends and had finally asked to change schools. Even now, Kent Easter was still waffling on what he did, while his ex-wife showed not an ounce of remorse, Marsirio said. He turned again to the crime novel. He reminded jurors that a promotional spot had appeared on YouTube right around the time the drugs were planted. It had featured a dramatic voiceover by Kent Easter. If you knew how to commit a perfect crime, would you do it? Kellie Peters is cowering in her house, crying with her daughter and her husband, scared out of her mind, worried she's going to be thrown in jail for God knows how long. And Kent and Jill Easter, they're toasting to the perfect crime, Marsirio said. We did it, honey. Clink. The perfect crime. Kent Easter sat in the hallway during the lunch break, clutching the legal pad on which he had scratched out his closing argument. I should have never hurt Kellie Peters, he told jurors when they returned. Still, he said, everybody had stood by her. The school had supported her. A policeman had detained her but not arrested her, handcuffed her, pulled a gun on her, locked her in his squad car, or taken her to jail. The polite and professional cop had not even raised his voice. Now came the abject plea for mercy. "I'm simply a parent of a young family that is broke," Easter said. "So I really come here already having lost everything I have except for my family. And I submit there is no further point to additional punishment." His words were plaintive, but his tone nearly robotic. It was as if he was talking about someone else, a character named Kent Easter that he did not particularly love, nor did jurors, who returned with a verdict of $5.7 million. He sat alone, looking stunned. To celebrate the verdict, Kellie Peters' friends threw her a party. They had bought a heart-shaped piñata and decorated it with blown-up copies of the Easter's mugshots. Someone gave Peters a stick. She held it, tentatively embarrassed, and administered some half-hearted thwacks. Her daughter, now 15, took the stick. The girl whose childhood had been blighted by the ordeal told her mother to step back. Some of the people in the room were laughing, and some of the people were already beginning to cry. She swung that stick full force. Paydays and 100-grand bars tumbled to the ground through the gash. 4 months after the verdict, Easter was back in court, this time in a handsome dark suit, telling the trial judge, Michael Brenner, that the damages were excessive, that Peters' attorney had failed to show he had means to pay. "The case law is clear on this," he argued, rattling off legal citations. Brenner's thought the damages were just about right, the jury's reasoning sound. It was easy to imagine how they figured it, he said. They saw two top-of-the-heap lawyers, a couple of real legal smarties, sophisticated people who had used their legal acumen in an attempt to destroy a woman who lived in a little apartment and who quit her job to volunteer at her daughter's school. The judge noted that Kent Easter could reapply for his law license after a 5-year suspension. Musing on his half-century in the law, the judge called this the most incomprehensible case I've ever seen and said, "I can't figure out why you and your ex-wife did what you did." The judge worked a rubber band with his fingers, gazing quizzically at Kent Easter. He was struck by Easter's flat effect during trial and reminded him that he'd never taken unambiguous responsibility for planting those drugs. "Your position on this is always very vague," the judge said. The jury could easily think, Mr. Easter has a plan, and what's he going to do is keep it just as vague as he can. He came right out and asked what everyone wanted to know. Who dreamed up this idea? The judge let the question hang there, while Kent Easter, sitting nearly motionless, said nothing. "It's just nuts," the judge continued, twisting the rubber band. "They're not exactly master criminals at a Boalt Hall in UCLA." More than 5 years after the drug planting, the upheavals ripple outward still. Kent Easter has filed for bankruptcy and appealed the civil verdict. So finding a way to get Kellie Peters her money has spawned another legal battle. In that effort, Peters' lawyers recently sued Jill Easter's father, 74-year-old Paul Borkholm, a retired scientist for EG&G Astrophysics who owns a $2 million Newport Beach home. Summoned to answer their questions, Borkholm sat uneasily across from the lawyers amid the clamor of a busy third-floor cafeteria at the Santa Ana courthouse. The lawyers grilled him about what happened in the summer of 2012 when, weeks after the Easters were arrested, they gave him their Irvine home. The house was sold, and the $171,000 in proceeds were split between Jill and Ken Easter, in trust Borkholm had agreed to oversee. The money rightfully belongs to Peters, the lawyers maintain. They are also asking for punitive damages against Borkholm, contending that because he participated in the home's fraudulent transfer, they may lay claim to his own assets. During the questioning, Borkholm said he had been reluctant when Kent Easter asked him to become a trustee so soon after the arrest. Nevertheless, he agreed to do it. At the time you were asked to do this, you were concerned that it might appear to be fraud? Mercerio asked. No other people might think so, Barcombe said. You're badgering me pretty hard, and I'm not happy with that. Mercio pressed for an answer. Why did it seem odd to you? Kent Easter was sitting beside his former father-in-law, and now he did as a lawyer would. He interjected. Objection. Asked and answered. Mercerio said, You're not his attorney. You're not a lawyer. Easter said, I'm a party here. You're taking a record. Mercerio's co-counsel, Roger Friedman, told Easter he could stay if he kept quiet, but threatened to get a court order if he interfered. As if Easter needed reminding, he added, You're not an attorney. Ask Kent Easter about it today, and he answers in urbane, unfailingly polite tones that his criminal defense was a pack of lies and distortions, and that he demonized his wife, that he pressured her into pleading guilty in the hope that he might go free. Nor was he her dupe. She was made out to be a cartoonish villainess, he said, the master planner, Ice Queen from Gone Girl. It makes this great archetype. She writes these true crime novels and planned this whole thing, but it's just absolutely not true. For his trials, he said, he embellished one of the defense's exhibits without his attorney's knowledge, the hectoring email in which his wife demanded that he get serious about destroying Peters. He says the all-caps last line with all of those exclamation points was his work, not hers, to beef things up, he said. It's hard to keep track of his shifting stories. In criminal court, he denied conspiring to plant the drugs and said his wife had done it alone. In civil court, he said he conspired with her, but that she had done the actual planting. Today, he says, she was not out there that night, but will not supply details. He worries about perjury charges for changing a story. He points to the county jail and says, I don't want to go back over there. He acknowledges that the crime was really not thought out very well, and adds, I didn't expect that half the Irvine Police Department would be working on this. He speaks of his ex-wife as if he still loves her. When he met her at their Silicon Valley firm in the mid-1990s, she was like no other woman he'd ever met, laser-focused on a legal career. She was a hiker, a student of history, the owner of a pet bunny. She turned out to be a great mother who used flashcards with their kids and got them reading by the age of 5. All the best moments in my life have been with her, he said. All the worst moments in my life have been with her, too. He is scratching out a living, he says, doing odd law-related jobs and freelance writing. Some time ago, he said, he met a woman and developed a romantic interest in her. He asked her out. They made plans. Then came the cancellation he half expected, expressed in 4 words. I just Googled you. One day, this spring, Kellie Peters drove to Hollywood to tape a segment of the Dr. Phil show. She hoped to promote a book she was co-writing called I'll Get You, Drugs, Lies, and the Terrorizing of a PTA Mom. She brought a mock-up of the cover, featuring herself in the crosshairs of a rifle scope beneath Jill Easter's glaring mugshot eyes. Dr. Phil obliged by holding it aloft, which she hoped would bump up the advance sales. She needed the money. Her husband had leukemia and was out of work, and the Easters had not paid a penny of the civil judgment. Entering the publicity circuit exacted a price, however. The producers had taped an interview with Jill Easter and filmed Peters as she watched fighting nausea. Easter was unrepentant. She accused Peters of having mistreated her son, leaving him crying and dirty. Easter portrayed the presence of her genetic material on the planted drugs as innocent, mere transfer DNA, an explanation that elicited little more than ridicule. It was not clear why Easter agreed to the interview. She came off so badly that the host asked at one point, "What's wrong with this woman?" For Peters, it is a relief, now that Easters have left the neighborhood, even if, last she heard, they are only one city over in Newport Beach. She walks her dogs along Irvine's trim streets and watches geese on the banks of the big artificial lakes. She smiles at the same people she has been passing for years. She asks about their family and their pets. It is friendly but dull. She misses the beach cities. Maybe when her daughter graduates from high school, she'll find a more exciting place. Hang on 1 second. Let me get another picture. Okay. Now and then, she runs into a member of the police department, the agency that saw through the lies and put 20 detectives on the case and saved her. They greet her like a friend, but act a little surprised to see her. Why hasn't she left town, considering all the bad memories? I feel safe here, she says. And that is the end.